Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome Paul McNelis today. Paul and I have worked together on and off for many years. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks very much, Sean. Good to be here.
So, Paul, just to kick off, if you can introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your early career and how you became involved in sustainability and sustainable procurement.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. So I'm currently the UK Director for DSS Plus. How did I come into contact with sustainability? Well, my original background was as a chemist and a researcher, and that took me into industry and the world of medical devices. And at some point I discovered I wasn't going to win a Nobel Prize through chemistry. So I decided to get into the world of standards. And initially that was medical devices and healthcare standards. And I joined BSI, but it was a really interesting time because, as you recall, there are a lot of standards, both national and international, like ISO 26000, ISO 20400 on sustainable procurement, that started to arise. And that really caught my interest, and I started to get involved in the development and the proliferation of sustainability standards. So that was like my first encounter with sustainability.
So how do you see the role of standards? Because, I get differing opinions, particularly in different parts of the world, as to, how effective standards can be in the shifting world of sustainability. It feels it takes so long to create a standard that it's out of date by the time is actually published.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, my involvement in standards originally was in what were known as fast-track standards. So you remember things like PAS 2050 on product carbon footprinting. And it was designed to address precisely that point, that industry needs to take action now. Sustainability has a certain urgency about it as well. And whereas getting consensus on standards can seem to take an eternity. So I was very much involved with fast-track standards right from the beginning. And that actually took me into contact with a lot of interesting companies. And the next step in my career actually was seeing these standards embodied on software platforms, so software as a service platforms. I actually came across the CEO of Achilles Information that you and I know quite well. And he was talking about standards, the need for standards and harmonization if we were really going to move the dial on carbon footprinting, on sustainability risk management and so forth in supply chains. And I thought, well, this guy really wants to get involved with developing standards. And actually, he ended up hiring me and I worked for Achilles. And then I saw a little bit, the potential through technology and standards to proliferate change rather more quickly. So, major ICT companies rolling this out to tens of thousands of suppliers through questionnaires, through joint audit programs, and really starting to move the dial. So I think technology has a big role to play if standards are going to have an impact.
So I guess the agenda moves around in terms of standards and compliance, and then management systems and ways of working. And I mean, it's interesting, as I was kind of being devil's advocate when I talked about, our standards are out of date by the time they're actually published. I understand from people in the world of standards that ISO 14001 is one of the most bought standards in the world. So it must have something going for it. And certainly, when I was involved in the development of ISO 2400, it was not about, this product must comply with, X, Y, Z. It was much more about how do you organize your procurement function in a way that can deliver sustainability. So any thoughts on that in terms of the different types of standards that we have these days?
Yeah, I think, of course, there are different types of standards. Some are for guidance and capability building. Some are explicitly designed to be in a management system or to be certified against. But I think my reflection on standards is they're a form of embodied knowledge. And as such, they need to be activated. And that's what I'm very interested in and have been involved in over the years, and what we at DSS Plus do a lot of, is unlocking the potential of that value and knowledge through actual operational implementation and also the right culture. So if you take ISO 20400, it's very well structured. It embodies and captures tons of knowledge of practitioners, but it's not immediately apparent how organizations put that into practice. And I think that's the case with most standards. And what we work on is let's say, the actual operational implementation, the human factor to realize the potential of those standards. That's very much our focus. So an individual, like a procurement professional or a health and safety professional, faced with a particular scenario, how should they behave? How should they act? What decisions should they make? That requires building capability, building culture, building knowledge in practice rather than this embodied knowledge. So I think that's perhaps why a lot of standards have still not yet achieved their full potential.
Absolutely. If we can go back to Achilles, and obviously a few more thoughts in terms of your time there. I also met the CEO and founder of Achilles many years ago, like you did, and he's quite a character. What fascinated me about Achilles, and actually it was part of what inspired me to start the supply chain school, was the collaborative nature of the way that Achilles works in families and groups of customers. Would you like just to expand on that a little bit and talk about how that works?
Yeah, I think that collaboration is key, and it's always been a feature of my career, whether it was working in BSI, working, as you say, in Achilles, and also working with sustainability leaders that have sought to move the dial somehow in an entire industry through standards. And, collaboration, let's say with the formal world of standards, is quite formulaic. It takes quite a long time. It's designed above all to reach consensus and be fair. But my time at Achilles was revealed another dimension to collaboration, which was a little bit more agile, a little bit more direct, people expressing the needs that they had to implement these standards through their supply chain, and then translating that into a roadmap, a software development roadmap in this case. And sometimes that was very easy. We need to add another question, or we need to update another question in the light of experience from our supplier qualification questionnaire, or something a little bit more profound. There's a new dimension of sustainability that we need to bring in, like our impacts on biodiversity. But that collaborative community, as you say, working together with the standards maker, and in this case with Achilles, that standards maker was also the standards implementer, had a hand in that. That close collaboration in an agile way, that's certainly key to unlocking the value that standards could bring to different industries.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So where next after Achilles?
Yeah, so I got a lot of experience in boutique companies, going very deep into life cycle assessment, product carbon footprints, looking at impacts across the supply chain. But when I moved on to the Big Four, so I joined EY, I was very interested in how are business leaders, whether that's chief procurement officers or CEOs, looking at procurement as a driver of value. What's their focus? What's their priority? And how do they understand or see the relevance of sustainability and sustainable procurement within that? And that was quite a revelation, because what I saw was chief procurement officers and those working with them, as we were, looking to do really ambitious projects to drive value, whether that's taking spend analysis and consolidating categories, really driving costs down, yielding multi-million benefits to the bottom line, or restructuring whole procurement operations and supply chain. So it was clear to me that this is a strategic value-adding function. It was also clear to me that most companies weren't looking at the sustainability component to add to that value. It was somewhere down the corridor in a different department. And the timescales were different, the KPIs were different, the mindset was different. And it became very difficult, as far as I could see, for anybody looking at these two worlds and two sets of information to actually make a smart decision. Perhaps a baseline decision would be, oh yeah, this supplier has been pre-qualified according to a questionnaire or an audit, and they're sustainable. Right, let's move on to the real business. And I think I always thought there's a lot more insight into risk and opportunity and value creation contained in that sustainability assessment. And if only you could unpack that, that would really be the key to better decision making for procurement functions and professionals.
Yeah, I think it comes to this point, as you say, in the early days of sustainable procurement, and certainly, I was involved, as you know, as a practitioner at the time. Sustainability people and what was, or environmental people as they were called at the time, and procurement people, just didn't speak the same language. If they ever spoke to each other at all, then they really didn't understand each other. And as you say, this whole idea of procurement as a strategic function, incorporating sustainability as one of those key objectives, is something that we all struggled with in the early days, and hopefully things are improving a little bit now. So I think you're absolutely right. That was, at the time, and we're talking, late 90s, early noughties now, I guess. That was really, really hard to actually get chief procurement officers of the day interested in sustainability being one of the corporate goals that they're expected to deliver, beyond, as you say, sending out a questionnaire, ticking a box and going, yeah, that's okay, and now we'll get on with the real business. How are you seeing things now? Has it changed much?
Well, it's interesting. To a degree, it's changed, and perhaps one of the triggers of that change has actually been sustainability professionals and chief sustainability officers being more specific in their goals and their programs and how they plan to add value. And I had the pleasure of working with some really great people, including, for example, Alan Knight, when he was Chief Sustainability Officer at ArcelorMittal. And, he had a very well-defined strategy. This is how we're going to reduce our footprint and our impacts around steel, because this is a material issue for climate change, for our industry, for all of our stakeholders. So, steel, I think, accounts still for about 7% of global carbon emissions. So it's a big issue. It's a sustainability issue. If we can do that and differentiate our product by being lower carbon emission product, which they've started to do, and even they've started to brand some specific product outputs in that way, our customers will prefer that product. And that will give us an advantage. It isn't necessarily a price premium, but it might be market access. It might be proximity to certain customers and a close collaboration with them. But really linking the impacts and this, if you think about double materiality, the impact that we have on the environment, but linking it to primary materiality, things that a business leader and investors will care about, driving value creation, bigger market share, differentiated product, benefit to the bottom line. These are things that really matter. So I think sustainability professionals being sharper on their game and their story and the reality of creating value, that helps. That helps them present themselves as a credible commercial peer to their counterpart, the chief procurement officer. And then it's a separate question, how's that collaboration between the two functions going? And we took a bit of a read on that at a recent event, actually last Thursday, and that was called Value Creation Through Sustainable Procurement, What Needs to Change? And it was very interesting, just kind of taking the temperature there. We had representatives from sustainability, investors, procurement folks, responsible procurement folks. It was a very broad and diverse crowd, and just taking the temperature there. I think one thing everybody agreed on very quickly was the standard of proof and the need to prove value through sustainability is really high right now. I mean, it's a kind of show me the money moment for sustainability as a whole. And the second thing was that, as we've been discussing, sustainable procurement is a really good place to start to show the money, because that's what procurement is all about, driving value for the business. And then finally, and again, to your point of have we advanced, the proposition was, look, there's still money on the table. There still isn't where it should be in terms of maturity. And I think that was pretty much the consensus. We heard a lot about functions sitting down together and talking and having a little breakthrough. We heard a lot about trying to align common goals and KPIs at a high level. But nobody was saying, oh, this is old hat and this is all done. Of course, sustainability is perfectly integrated into procurement. That certainly wasn't the case.
No, I think it's there is clearly more to do. But it's interesting, a few things in the discussion that you pointed out. The whole concept of chief sustainability officer. I mean, there weren't chief sustainability officers 5 years ago, certainly weren't 10 years ago. I think you make a really good point there in terms of sustainability people being at or closer to the top table in organisations, and also having that business focus to talk about the benefits of doing it or indeed the risks of not doing it, and understanding the power of procurement to make that happen, depending on where you are around the world and what type of organisation you work for. An awful lot of organisations deliver an awful lot of what they do through their supply chains. I mean, it varies from sector to sector, but nonetheless, the supply chain element is very key to what we do. And that gives your chief procurement officer more power and more influence over their supply chain if they're taking some of these things on board. But where next? How do you see the future and where we're going with this whole concept of sustainable procurement?
Well, I think, as you say, there's more to be done, and the proposition that we put on the table that people showed up for and in a way validated was there's more value there in sustainable procurement in particular. I think there was a real appetite for this conversation, and I think that appetite will continue to grow. And part of it is the dilemma that sustainability professionals have been facing with the recent waves of regulation. So just before joining DSS Plus, I was at an event in London in the Gherkin, and the topic was CSRD, how are we doing? It was hosted by a software company that will, offer some pretty good solutions to helping with that headache. And I think the consensus was, we're not doing very well. It's a huge burden. It's consuming all of our time and attention. Here comes compliance and reporting again. That was the panel conversation. And then the conversation at the tables over dinner was, I want to get back to value creation. This isn't what I joined for. So I think there's this backlash against regulation and reporting can actually serve the cause of actually creating value through sustainability pretty well. And as you say, now chief sustainability officers and the sustainability dialogue as a whole is raising its game. So the stakes are raised, and at the same time, the profession is raising its game to be on a par and have the right kind of conversation with their peers, whether it's chief finance officer or chief procurement officer. And I think, entering that space, I think the language of just the business case for sustainability is changing. Sustainability professionals are understanding that there's a lot of value to be unlocked, but this is not easy. You've got to build a capability. When organizations get serious about any topic, they understand where they are, they assess their maturity. That's one area, of course, that standards can help with. They then set about systematically growing that capability and maturity, and then implementing it to drive value. And they monitor and measure that with a really serious intent, because usually the investments required to move the dial are significant investments, whether it's in acquisition or capital expenditure or changing their operations in some fundamental way. So I think stepping into that space, having to have a higher standard of proof, having to have a better business case and business language is really a bit of a gift for sustainability folks to get onto. Get into that conversation. And I think we're just starting to see examples of value being proven. So those that have made those investments, particularly in product sustainability and supply chain sustainability, differentiating their offer to their customers and securing higher market share and preferred status. And that's something that's very easy to quantify. It might cost a lot in terms of the investments, but it's very easy to quantify the value and the return on that. So I'm rather optimistic that those organizations that take this seriously, step up, collaborate well with their colleagues and leaders in procurement will really start to unlock a different level of value.
Yeah, it's interesting that at the beginning you described CSRD as a headache. I think a lot of people are seeing it that way at the moment. But hopefully we'll get over that. I mean, with any new regulation around reporting, and like you, I'm kind of a bit conflicted around this. We could end up with the world of sustainability just being about compliance and reporting. And it ain't like that. And it shouldn't be, and it can't be. And as you say, ultimately it's all about value creation. But like anything, you've got to demonstrate it. And if you look at, accounting standards have been around for, about 200 years, and everybody just accepts that now that's the way that we count the money. And I think it needs to be the same going forward about the carbon and the waste and the social value and all of those things. But we're in a very immature space. around reporting at the moment.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think maybe it's back to how do you make standards and the process and the thinking around them and unlocking the value. I think the CSRD, what's happening now with this rollback in the omnibus is people are saying, maybe this is a bit of a burden. How could we unlock the value of it? The original intent was to focus on materiality, the things that matter most, and to have them addressed effectively. So there's a layer of pragmatism being asked for now, which arguably could have been injected into the process earlier on. Easy to say with hindsight. But the intent is good. But I think going in lockstep with building the pragmatic steps, actually implementing compliance to these regulations and these standards into your organization, building the governance, building the maturity, actually driving value. I think that's a better way to start to engage with these frameworks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. You mentioned ISO 2400 earlier, and obviously that's our thing, ISO2400.org. How are you seeing the use of the standard? I mean, it's not a new standard anymore. It's been around for, I think, 7 years now. How are you seeing the uptake? Are people really taking it seriously? Are people really seeing the benefits?
I think once people become aware of it, they understand it's a very significant benchmark that will help them understand where they are. I think that's the first introduction to the standard. I think people are sometimes daunted when they're struggling with the operational complexity of doing any one thing in sustainability of procurement. Let's say tackling their scope 3 carbon emissions, for example. They're a little bit daunted by the idea that there might be even more in terms of scope and complexity challenges to unpack. So I think there is a bit of trepidation. I think if we can express the value of this, again, in building capability, understanding where you are, building the capability, building the culture, creating value through that process, I think people will be less afraid of the standard. And that's the approach that we take if we're introducing 20,400.
So, Paul, you mentioned ISO 2400 earlier. How are you seeing the uptake of it? Are people using it? Are people seeing the benefits of the standard?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as we were saying, sometimes organizations and individuals can be a little bit daunted by a standard which is so comprehensive and complex. And often they'll be struggling with one particular issue. Say, for example, scope 3 emissions, how to measure them, how to reduce them. And then the idea of being comprehensive across more issues with more depth and more complexity can be a little bit daunting. But what we do is help organizations understand that this is part of value creation. You can use the standard to, first of all, understand how mature your operation is on this topic, which is really important if you're going to go anywhere and set your ambitions for the future. And then secondly, it can help you systematically build capability, maturity, and the right culture. And that's what we're all about. We're all about transforming from the inside by building the right capability and the right culture. I think 20,400 and the conversations we're having around it is really standing up very well to that test of value creation as a driver of maturity and capability.
Yeah, thanks. It can be a bit daunting at the time. It's 50-odd pages. It's quite a tome to actually read. And as you know, I was part of the committee that created it. And there's a lot of good stuff that's packed in there. And of course, achieving consensus around 40 odd different countries has been quite a challenge. So it is about making it simple. And as you know, what we try to do on ISO2400.org is to have a self-assessment. You answer 20 questions, it will give you some idea of where you are. It's free of charge, it's easy to do. It's not the whole picture. To do a comprehensive evaluation against ISO 2400 is a lot more than 20 questions, but at least it enables people to make a start, because I think that's the challenge, is getting people to be brave enough to take that first step, recognising that it is a complex thing and you're looking at potentially transforming an entire, procurement function, but also an entire organisation in some cases, but take small steps to start with. Do you have examples? I mean, you talk about value creation through sustainable procurement. Do you have some good examples, case studies that you've worked on that people can learn from and be inspired by?
We had quite a few examples that were shared at our recent event on sustainable procurement by our guest speaker, Dave Howson. They were quite interesting. And what he did was look at each scenario where there was a decision to be made about how to interact with suppliers. And he had one, for example, from the drinks industry where they were engaging with their suppliers to look at their impacts and also look at price. And this was a rather salutary tale, really, because the procurement function weren't very well informed about sustainability, about innovation, about the bigger picture, dare I say, beyond price. And the way that they engaged with their supply base was rather one-dimensional, but they were showing the near-term returns, contribution to bottom line, price savings, cost savings, until the supply chain actually was eroded to such a degree that it presented them with a price spike and an increase in prices of about 40%. So that was quite an extreme case of, let's say, how to do it wrong and not take that broader view, and the direct impact on the bottom line. Then, of course, there were some more encouraging cases, for example, having to comply with a customer's requests. And this is typically, one of the stimulus for many companies. They'll get a request to comply with a very high standard of sustainability performance as a supplier themselves. And that will trigger some reflections. And, it became very clear quite quickly that looking into the traceability, the origins, and the impacts of several commodities in this case, wrapped up with some quite complex issues, whether they're environmental or human rights in some cases. Unpacking that, having the data, having the trust in that data, and being able to present that to the customer was really quite a significant undertaking. And so it caused, again, it raised the stakes and caused an internal discussion of, well, what's it worth to get this right, and what did it cost if we get it wrong? And pretty much getting it wrong was not an option because there were other providers willing to snap up that business. So that triggered an investment that probably, in that particular case, needed to show returns over a period of time, quite a long time scale. But they did succeed in mastering the data, having their story straight, complying with the standard, and retaining and expanding that customer. So that was a kind of moment of truth case. And I think that helped the wider cause of embedding sustainability into procurement. I think if you come without a clear case or a moment of truth, it's sometimes hard to just say, this would be a great idea, wouldn't it? It sounds like, more activity, more cost, more time. People need something very tangible. And that was a big theme in the conversation as well. Procurement leaders are having to react very rapidly, make decisions rapidly. They're under a lot of pressure. If you have an example that presents itself in that scenario and you're able to be part of the solution, that can be a great moment of truth for proving this.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's a really interesting example because that's about a customer-driven change. And you described a moment of truth. I think some people might say burning platform or whatever. There comes a point in time where we've got to do this. And I suppose really it's a question of, for most organisations, are you going to wait for that time when you're threatened by losing business or potentially losing investors, or the cost of borrowing becomes greater? Because all of those elements there are focusing on greater sustainability, to an extent, regardless of what's going on in the world and what certain political opinions are saying. Businesses, organisations are still very much on this track. So one of the things that the standard does encourage you to do right at the very beginning is ask yourself why. What is it that's driving you to do sustainable procurement? Because if you don't understand why, then you can't evaluate the what. What is it we're trying to achieve? Always start with why. So I think that's a really good example of an organisation driven by a customer, and then actually that permeating right the way through the organisation.
Yeah, and I think that scenario was one of potential loss. So organisations can be very good at reacting to threats and risks because they have to take action. There are cases that I have come across and worked on happily that are a little bit more proactive. So organisations saying, well, we want to launch a particular brand. We work with a cosmetics company, and they wanted to launch a brand in the US with a particular attribute. And being a consumer-facing company, they've done all their research into what consumers value and what would make them choose our brand over another. And it was actually basically taking care of animal cruelty and being cruelty-free, improving that. Now, the undertaking to do that was technically quite complex to have traceability of all your ingredients through your supply chain. So it necessarily had a lot of elements that required collaboration across functions. So you'd need procurement, supply chain, you'd need the marketing department, you need regulatory affairs, but jointly making the case that the value could be, that it was technically feasible to do the work, that it was desirable from a marketing point of view, and that it was something that could be implemented operationally. That team was able to make the case and realize the outcome. And that organization told us that, I won't quote a particular figure, but the launch of that brand with that one attribute in that one market was worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Wow, that's a fantastic example. Yeah, thank you. Paul, final question, if I may. A lot of our audience for our podcast are people that are relatively new to sustainable procurement. Some of them are people that have kind of been told, you're doing sustainable procurement, get on with it. What would your advice be to somebody coming new into this world that's been given a challenge of procuring more sustainably?
Well, first of all, well done. What a fantastic career opportunity. Secondly, you've got to think about collaboration. You've got to think about the fact that you are at the intersection of two traditions, two different ways of thinking, and that you could be, the opportunity for you is to be the bridge. I would recommend connecting with communities of practice, such as your own. There's a lot of people now really passionate about and experienced in this field. So connect with others, take that learning and take that inspiration. And as you said a moment ago, stay close to the why, stay close to the business case, articulate the business value first and the value of solving problems or unlocking opportunities. And then, provide the reassurance that you've got the technical know-how and you can help them on the journey. But start with why, very much so, and be part of a great and vibrant community working on this.
Yeah, thanks for a fantastic career opportunity. I couldn't have put it better myself. Of course, it's an opportunity. It's not another burden, another job to be done. This is very much the way that the future is going in procurement. Paul, it's been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure our audience will as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Sean. Always a pleasure. Thanks. Speak soon.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.